Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today we're looking at our final election prediction for the 2026 U.S. Senate Republican Special Election Primary. This is to fill the remainder of fill a Republican nomination for the Senate seat to replace Lindsey Graham in the U.S. Senate. We're going to break down who all the candidates are, where things currently stand ahead of Tuesday's primary to see which candidates will advance, or maybe both will potentially advance to a Republican primary runoff. So without further ado, let's just get into this. So if you're unfamiliar with the backstory on this race, Republican U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham passed away on July 11th, 2026. You probably have heard this news by now if you're watching this video, but that did happen. And then under South Carolina law, a special primary election will be held on August 11th, which obviously is Tuesday, to select a Republican nominee. The 3-week campaign made for an unusually compressed U.S. Senate race, per Wikipedia. And also a very important note here on this race that South Carolina does, that not every state does. If no candidate receives a majority of the vote, meaning 50% of the vote or more, like 50.01% or so, a runoff election between the top two vote getters will be held on August 25th. So that's going to be an important note here because it's looking like the possibility of no candidate breaking 50% is very much real. The candidate filing period opened at noon on July 21st and closed at noon on July 28th. The South Carolina State Election Commission ruled that the special election Republican primary will be treated as a continuation of the June 9th primary. Accordingly, only voters who participated in the Republican primary or did not vote in either party's June 9th primary are eligible to vote. So Democrats or people who voted in the Democratic primary are ineligible. So with all that said, let's get now into the candidates and who they are. There are actually, despite only about a week of a filing period, there are a lot of candidates running. The names that you're going to need to be most familiar with are Darline Graham, who is the sister of the late Senator Lindsey Graham, who's the incumbent U.S. Senator as of now. She was appointed by President Trump and by, I believe, the Governor Henry McMaster of South Carolina to fill the remainder of the term of Lindsey Graham's seat. She is now running for a full term in South Carolina to carry on her brother's legacy. So she is one of the main names to know in this race. There are two other names that I would put just a tier below that are important to know are Russell Fry, the representative of the South Carolina's 7th Congressional District in the state, and Ralph Norman, U.S. Representative of the 5th District in the state of South Carolina and in this district over here in like the northern part of the state. There are some other candidates running as well whose names may be familiar. If you're from South Carolina, Mark Sanford, the former governor of South Carolina, Mark McBride, the former mayor of Myrtle Beach, Mark Lynch, who ran against Graham in the initial primary back in June and early July as well. Also are names you may recognize. But for the purpose of today's video, and I'll show you the polling in just 1 second, the three most notable names you're going to need to know are Darline Graham, Russell Fry, and Ralph Norman. And here's why. When we look at the early polling, and we'll do the endorsements in just one moment, Darline Graham, Russell Fry, or Ralph Norman have finished first, second, or third in every single one of these polls thus far. There's only been 3 polls to go off of, and they all came from the end of July to just the end of July, really. None really stretch into early August yet. And I'm recording this video on the weekend, so there's possible that more polls have come out since you're seeing this video, but As of the time, I'm recording this video, this is where things stand. The most recent poll from Coefficient shows Darline Graham at 30% of the vote. Russell Fry has 16% of the vote. Ralph Norman has 15%. And then the rest of the candidates have under 10, with Mark Sanford at 9, Mark Lynch at 6, 4% for other, and 20% still undecided. The Trafalgar Group poll showed that Darline Graham's at 27%, Russell Fry at 17%, Ralph Norman at 17%, Mark Sanford up to 15%, and Mark Lynch at 8%, with 12% of the vote undecided in that one. And then the Emerson College poll shows Ralph Norman actually leading at 22%, Darline Graham in second at 19%, Russell Fry at 12%, Mark Sanford at 11%, Mark Lynch at 7%, with 25% of the vote undecided. Now, I'm bringing these up, and I haven't mentioned Mark Sanford as much because based on the most recent odds that we've seen from this race on both Kalshi and Polymarket, it looks pretty likely that we're going to see Darline Graham, Russell Fry, and Ralph Norman finish on the top 3. Mark Sanford's current odds only are at 3% to be the special Senate the Senate special primary winner. So based on those alone, he's probably not going to end up finishing in the top 3, let alone the top 2. On Polymarket, similar, Sanford's at 4% to win. But the odds for the rest are pretty consistent. Darline Graham's polling or running on these prediction markets in first place around 50%. Russell Fry and Ralph Norman, though, essentially have the same percentages to finish in second place. Russell Fry and Ralph Norman do. And when we couple that with the polling that we've seen here, showing very close races between Russell Fry and Ralph Norman, it's very close. Now, you may be wondering, well, why am I talking about second place so much? Does it matter? Doesn't whoever finished first win? And as the top of the Wikipedia article states, no, if no candidate breaks 50% of the vote, the top 2 candidates will advance to a runoff election on August 25th. And based on where things currently stand in the polling data right now, unless the polls ultimately end up being massively off, there's probably not enough undecided vote left out there for whether it's Darline Graham, Russell Fry, or Ralph Norman to break 50% of the vote. So we're probably going to see a situation on election night where Darline Graham ends up finishing first, or maybe Ralph Norman or Russell Fry ends up finishing first, but no candidate's going to break 50% of the vote, and we're going to have a runoff election between the top 2 vote getters. The question will be ultimately, who are the top 2 going to be, and who ends up being the third candidate that narrowly misses? And that's going to be the question here. When we look at the endorsements, Russell Fry has the endorsement of the House Majority Leader, Davey Hiott, 5 state senators, and 34 other state representatives. But Darline Graham has the biggest endorsement, obviously the President of the United States, Donald Trump. That carries a lot of weight in the Republican primaries. She also has the endorsement of 3 U.S. senators from John Barrasso, Shelley Moore Capito, and Tom Cotton. And that certainly will give her a very large boost in this primary. Her also being the brother of Lindsey Graham should help her out a good bit as well. But Ralph Norman's got some pretty big names as well. He's got the endorsement of Mark Meadows, the former White House Chief of Staff in President Trump's first term. Former U.S. Senator Jim DeMint, U.S. Senator Mike Lee, and U.S. Senator Rick Scott has endorsed him, as well as one-time governor rival Nancy Mace has also endorsed Ralph Norman. And then Mark Sanford doesn't really have too many endorsements. He has Tom Davis as well. So from the endorsement game and from the polling game, it definitely seems like it's a 3-way race between Darline Graham, Russell Fry, and Ralph Norman. Just going off the endorsements here, it would seem more likely that's going to be Ralph Norman and Darline Graham that advance to the general, whereas Russell Fry doesn't have the same number of endorsements and same level of them as the other 2 do. So is that going to be an ultimately indicator of how this goes? We'll have to wait and see. But it is interesting that Russell Fry is in second in the coefficient poll over Ralph Norman. In the Trafalgar Group poll, he's tied with Norman. And then in the Emerson poll, Graham and Norman are first and second, and Russell Fry is in a distant third at 12%. So how does this ultimately go? Well, we're going to have to wait and see, obviously, for the results to play out on Tuesday, how it goes here. But I think we're looking at a situation where Darline Graham ends up finishing either in first or narrowly behind first place. But I think she'll definitely be one of the 2 for sure. The question is going to be Ralph Norman or Russell Fry for that other spot. And for this, we're going to go to the election simulator website, theelectionenjoyer.com here, where they have their page set up for what a simulation, they currently have it, how it's looking. And then I'm also going to adjust some of the numbers here to show what I think an election like this could look like. So their current prediction on the map right now has Ralph Norman getting about 24.5% of the vote, and it goes to Ralph Norman in first place. Darline Graham finishes in second at 19.8%, and that means even though they have Norman as the winner, both of them will go to a runoff election on August 25th, with Norman and Graham facing off. Russell Fry finishes in third with 13.6%. He misses out on the runoff. I don't disagree with the top 2 being Norman and Graham. I do disagree a little bit with the numbers, though. I'm not sure Ralph Norman finishes first, and even if he does, I'm not totally convinced the vote numbers are going to be that spread out. I think it might be a situation where Darline Graham ends up finishing first around like 25, maybe 26% of the vote. Ralph Norman right behind her at like 24%. And then we see Russell Fry probably being around like, 13 to 15% of the vote, if not even higher, up to like 19%. I think we're going to see a good amount of vote consolidated among the top 3 of Graham, Norman, and Fry. And we may see Mark Lynch's numbers go down a little bit. Mark Sanford's numbers go up a bit as well. But I think we're going to see a situation here very similar to the initial primary for governor, where there's going to be a lot of votes split across the state. and the regions across the state are going to be an indicator of how things are going. So my prediction would essentially have it being something like this on the initial round, where Darline Graham starts out around 26% of the vote, Ralph Norman about 24%, Russell Fry around 19%. And you can see the areas of the state here where they do well. Ralph Norman does well throughout these orange parts of the state on the map here, including doing well in the Charleston area. Darline Graham does well in the Columbia area and Sumter areas of the state up near Greenville as well. Russell Fry wins a few counties just north of Columbia and south of Rock Hill. And that's essentially it for the counties in terms of how they overall vote on the map here, So that's where things currently stand on that side of things. So for my prediction for how I think this is going to go between Graham, Norman, and Fry, it's a split prediction where I think Darline Graham ends up finishing first, and I think she defeats Ralph Norman by right around a lean Republican margin, which is a 1 to 5 point margin of victory. I think we see Darline Graham finish around that 26 to 27% number, and I think Ralph Norman will be right behind her around like 24%, where it's going to be like a 2 to like a 4 point win for Graham there. And then for Ralph Norman over Russell Fry, I think we're going to see Norman defeat Russell Fry by about like 5 to 8 points or so, separating the two of them. So Graham or Norman would have a likely margin of victory over Fry in that, which would mean that Darline Graham and Ralph Norman advance to a runoff election. And then from there, it's going to be really interesting to see whether Norman or Graham ends up winning, because Graham has the endorsement of President Trump, being the sister of Lindsey Graham. But Ralph Norman, there's definitely seems to be a real appetite among some South Carolina Republicans to maybe, after years of Lindsey Graham holding the Senate seat, have someone not named Graham hold the Senate seat and maybe have Ralph Norman do it. So that could be a very interesting runoff election if that does ultimately happen. I do still think Darline Graham would be favored, though, given she has the endorsement and support of the president already. I think she would end up winning it by a likely margin, which is in between 5 and 15%. But I don't know it's going to be an absolute blowout either. I think there's a real opportunity for Ralph Norman to win in that runoff if that did ultimately happen. But for tonight, for what we're expecting on Tuesday, I'm expecting a lean Republican win of right around 2 to 4 points for Darline Graham over Ralph Norman. I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are, though. Leave them down in the comment section down below. Thank you so much for watching, and hope to see you in a future video. So I hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you did, I really appreciate it if you could hit like and hit subscribe as well. It would really help me and my channel out a whole lot if you could do that for me. You can see in the circle in the top left the subscribe here button to subscribe to the channel. On the right, there are going to be 2 video pop-ups for you. My latest video will be on the top, and a recommended playlist by myself will be on the bottom as well. In the bottom left of the screen, you'll see my channel name, Anthony's Election Center, which you are currently watching. On my Facebook, Anthony.ElectionCenter is also there. And if you want to reach out to me on email, anthpredicts@gmail.com is my email. Feel free to pause the video if you need to. If you want to look for any of these, obviously in more time, please feel free. But for now, though, that is it. I really thank you all for watching and hope to see you in a future video.